Well, great job on the homework, Melissa. You really did a fantastic job. We'll talk a little bit more at the end of this session, too, about homework for this coming week. But great job. You're doing really good.
Thanks.
So this session actually has two major segments to it. The first is we're going to talk a little bit more about the common reactions that people have following a trauma or a really intense experience. We mentioned a little bit about that last time, how there's some really normal ways that people tend to respond to trauma. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that today and talk a little bit about what your experience was like. And then we're really going to shift gears. It's going to be a kind of a change in topic that's not always the most easy transition. So we'll just do something entirely different at that point. And we'll talk about the in vivo exposure like we mentioned last time that we were going to do this week. So and we'll talk about the reasons that we're going to do it. We'll make that list that we mentioned before. And then we'll go through and rate the items on the list so that we can understand how they compare to one another and how distressing they may be. And we'll have you start doing some in vivo exposure exercises this week for homework as well. Okay. Any questions before we get started?
No.
Okay. So, like I mentioned last time, when somebody is exposed to a trauma, the reactions, the experiences, the symptoms, if you will, that somebody has following that are really normal. Most people who experience a trauma have very similar reactions, especially in those hours, days, and weeks following that trauma exposure. And like we said before, for most people, they may go on to return over time through a natural recovery into normal functioning or regular functioning, how they functioned before, and other people kind of get stuck. But everybody is very similar right after a traumatic experience. So let me ask you a little bit, are there things that really stood out to you, things that you experienced right after that service member who showed up on your table?
I guess I was having some nightmares.
Okay.
I still am.
Yeah. And you actually make a really interesting point there. You had some nightmares following that, and that's really normal. We hear that from a lot of folks, and you're still having them. And in many ways, and that's really consistent with what we were just saying, that a lot of those reactions that you had right afterwards, so the same things that a lot of people experience afterwards, kind of get extended. And so the nightmares you're having now, my guess is that those nightmares are similar to nightmares you had then as far as content, theme?
Yeah.
What kind of things are in them?
I guess sort of seeing the same thing over and over, seeing that, night.
Almost like you're kind of re-experiencing that or reliving that.
Yeah. Kind of.
There's a whole cluster of these common reactions, as we're calling them, that I would put in that re-experiencing, or sometimes they're called intrusion reactions. And so nightmares are a really common one. We tend to dream about the stuff that we've experienced, especially the more intense kinds of things. And so it's really normal to have dreams, bad dreams, nightmares about those experiences or similar themes too. Sometimes during the day, we can have a somewhat similar experience. For example, needing to concentrate on other things, needing to be paying attention to something else, and thoughts and memories or images from that experience are kind of pushing their way in, if you will. They're kind of intruding on your thinking space. Sometimes they can be pretty vivid. And so that's also a really common experience. I'm wondering if that's something that you're familiar with.
Occasionally I'll see something, maybe that reminds me of it. Sure.
Yeah. Other things in that same cluster, sometimes people can even feel as though that experience is happening again. And you may have heard the term flashback, and it's almost as if they're seeing, hearing, feeling as though those events were happening again. And in some ways, that's kind of more of that more intense version of those intrusive thoughts during the day. Anything similar to that?
Maybe a little bit.
Okay. Oh. And it really does happen on a continuum. So happening a little bit, that makes a lot of sense. And I think this one is probably familiar to you too. You mentioned this when we first met. Sometimes physiological or emotional reactions to reminders or triggers. So maybe your heart starts beating a lot faster, or start sweating, or feeling kind of edgy, needing to get out of there, kind of a feeling. And maybe even some emotions too, having those emotions come back that were connected to that experience that you were reminded of. Again, something that you're familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, sort of like at my cousin's wake.
Right, yeah. And you did describe those very well, actually. So that whole cluster there, we call those the re-experiencing or the intrusion kind of reactions. And similarly, like we said before, it's really normal for these to happen immediately following the traumatic experience. And then for some people, those can continue on past those first few weeks after that experience, and similar to what's happening with you here. We mentioned avoidance quite a bit last time, and that's another one of the major clusters of common reactions too. It's really normal for people, especially right after a traumatic event, to avoid anything that reminds them of what happened, to avoid those negative feelings that came with it, to avoid people, places, situations. And you mentioned a few of those things. Certainly avoiding situations where you're feeling like you are not experiencing the emotion that you should,
Yeah.
or what you think you should,
Yeah.
or perhaps what others maybe are expressing at the time. Are there other things you find yourself avoiding?
I haven't been like playing with my cousins' kids, like, or basically my nieces and nephews.
Okay. And so that's a great example too. In a minute, we're going to start making a list of some things that you may be avoiding too. And so let's make sure we get that one on the list. Okay. The avoidance can really come in other ways too. You mentioned this feeling of not being able to experience, or not feeling like you're experiencing emotions the way maybe you used to, or that others around you may be experiencing them. That can also be really normal, this feeling almost of emotional numbness, or that, again, that those feelings, perhaps more so positive feelings than negative feelings, are a little more numbed or a little less strong. And you gave some good examples of that too. And then too, this isolation, this feeling disconnected, that can also be a really, really common thing. Again, those who don't necessarily go on to have, a PTSD diagnosis and don't continue to have the same level of distress or disruptions in their day-to-day life that you've been describing, still end up feeling a lot of these things and experience these things immediately following a trauma. So, yeah. And even to the point, there are some folks that may express that they're feeling as though they're more vulnerable than they used to be, that maybe bad things can happen to them, or more likely to happen to them, perhaps even to the point of not thinking much about the future, or that maybe the future isn't something they need to worry about. Is that something you're familiar with at all?
I guess it's more like a feeling that, like, why am I doing something, but I don't really think it's feeling more vulnerable. I mean, I actually feel like less, like I feel more closed off,
Okay. Yeah. So again, kind of those feelings being a little more numbed, or feeling less, more closed off.
It's more so that.
Absolutely. Again, so there's that cluster of those kinds of reactions that people have. And then another cluster that we talk about is, we sometimes call it the hyperarousal cluster, or what we mean by that is that kind of physiologically being more revved up. So that can come across in several ways. That could be just this increased level of tension chronically, feeling a little more revved up all the time than before. Any feelings like that?
Not so much. I mean, sometimes if I'll wake up in the middle of the night, and I've had a bad dream or something, then I'll, feel a little anxious and tense, but, not other times.
So it's not like a constant kind of feeling, which is great. You did mention the sleep issues.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about those, because that's another one that's really normal as part of this cluster too. So what's happening with you for sleep?
It's not so much falling asleep. It's more so I'll wake up in the middle of the night if I've had a nightmare, and I'll have trouble going back to sleep. And I've been late a few times to work, so that's been a problem.
So going back to sleep, and again, pretty normal things that we've heard, but have trouble going back to sleep because you're too revved up, or having trouble going back to sleep because you don't want to have another nightmare, or?
Probably a little bit of both.
Okay. And so then how does that, you said you've been late to work, how does that impact you getting into work, waking up too early?
Well, I just kind of, eventually, if I fall back asleep, it ends up being too late, and then I'll wake up late, or I'll be exhausted in the morning or something, and then I think it's definitely negatively affecting me at work, because, it's kind of an issue to be late in the military. So
again, not uncommon at all to hear about how these reactions or these symptoms are impacting work functioning, or impacting relationships, whether that's family, friends, significant others. All those things can be impacted. It makes a lot of sense, right? If you're not getting a lot of sleep, if you're feeling detached from other people, if you're having kind of these intrusive thoughts or physiological reactions, all these things together make it really difficult at times to perform your normal functions and to really nurture those relationships. Again, something that's familiar to you?
Yes.
Yeah. Certainly with regards to your work, it's not even like a regular civilian job where if you're late a few times, somebody can look the other way. The military doesn't tend to.
No, they don't look the other way.
They don't tend to like that too much. Some other things in that that last cluster that we've been talking about too, sleep's certainly one of them. I think you mentioned before, the first time we met, some issues around maybe being able to concentrate or pay attention on things that you need to do.
Yeah, that's, I think, more so because I'm tired than anything else.
Okay. And again, it makes a lot of sense then, right? If you're not getting enough good sleep. That can also, for some people, kind of show up as being a little more irritable or getting angry a little more easily, maybe to things that didn't used to bother the person.
No, I'm not really feeling that.
Great. So again, this cluster, lots of different ways that this can show up. One last way that I want to ask you about is one that we sometimes call hypervigilance. And what that means is maybe kind of always being on guard or looking for potential risk or potential danger, maybe even looking over your shoulder, just to kind of be aware of everything that's going on around you.
Being aware is always a good idea,
Okay.
But I don't think it's been aggravated in any way.
Okay. Well, and that's a great point to make. Certainly in the military, you're trained to do that, right? You need to be aware of what's going on around you. That's a skill you have to do your mission downrange. And if you don't have that on board, that could be problematic. For some folks, they kind of they kind of bring that skill back with them when they come back, and they're extra sensitive to the environment. And while, as I agree with you, that it's a good idea to be aware of what's going on around you, so you're saying it doesn't feel like it's to an excess or more so than other reasonable people in your life?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, great. Good. Another one that's not necessarily falling in any one of these categories, but is another one that we hear pretty often, is folks might have, in a way of trying to help themselves feel a little better or a little more normal, may turn to alcohol or drugs, substances to try to deal with, like we said, in the short run, deal with some of the things they're feeling. Any issues with that there? Okay, great. Well, good. Any questions from you or anything that I haven't mentioned that you're wondering about that you feel like is going on with you and you're wondering if it's related?
Not really, no.
Great. Well, so what I'm going to do, again, I'll give you another handout like I did last time. This one's going to summarize kind of the stuff we've covered here. What's kind of that normal reaction that people have after a traumatic experience or experiences. And it just goes over many of the things we talked about. And so I'll ask you again, kind of to read that between now and our next session. And if you feel like it, you're certainly welcome to share that with your mother or with others. That's certainly up to you. You don't have to, but you're certainly welcome to do that. And I'll give that to you at the end as we're talking about homework assignments and things that we'll have you do between sessions. Does that sound okay?
Yeah.